Okay, welcome. Welcome to all of you to our YouTube live stream interview on disability justice and spirituality in the Christian world with Allison Connelly-Vetter. Just really excited. Welcome, welcome. So great to have you here.
So good to be here.
Just to give you all a little bit of an introduction to Allison, for those of you who don't know her in our community, she is a CSJ connection that we'll talk about. Allison Connelly-Vetter holds a Master of Divinity from Union Theological Seminary with a concentration in disability theology. She is currently working in church communications, faith-based racial justice organizing, and children, youth, and families ministries. She serves on the United Church of Christ Disabilities Ministries Board and preaches and teaches on disability theology for religious congregations, conferences, and institutions around the country. Denominationally, Allison is both Catholic and United Church of Christ and is affiliated with the Sisters of St. Joseph, both as a St.
Yay!
Joseph worker and a consociate. She lives in Minneapolis, Minnesota with her wife, Brooklyn. So we are so lucky to have her here and to have her as a part of the CSJ community. And I just can't wait for all of you to meet her, get to know her better, and listen to some of the wisdom that she has to share with us. So welcome, Allison.
Well, thanks so much. It's so delightful to be
All
here.
of you
I really
to meet her, get to know her better, and listen to some of the wisdom that she. Okay. Go ahead. Sorry.
It's so good to be here. I really appreciate you inviting me, and I'm honored to be part of this series.
Yeah, it's great. Great to have you. Um, wow. So yeah, I just again I would like to have you start by talking about something just that you're really excited about around disability justice or disability theology at this point in your work.
Yeah. Something I think about a lot is this concept of interdependence. So this is not independence. It's not I'm alone. It's not a codependence, we're kind of don't have any distinction between who we are. This is interdependence, this idea that we all need each other. And I really have learned about interdependence from the disability justice movement, which is something I'll talk about more later. But the disability justice movement teaches us that there is no being that doesn't need other beings. This is true for humans. This is true for all forms of life. This is true from who we are at our youngest and smallest to who we are at our oldest and at the end of our lives. This is true for the entire scope of our being on this planet. There is never a time when any being could go it alone and could survive on their own. But we're told that we can, right? We're told capitalism tells us you can do it alone. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps and you can make it work. You just have to work hard and put your nose to the grindstone. And disability justice says that's not true, and it's not true for disabled people, and it's actually not true for anybody. That we all need each other. That is the nature of being human, is to need one another. And this is true in big ways, and it's true in small ways. It's true in the ways that disabled people will help each other get groceries, or watch each other's kids, or teach each other the best kind of heating pad for a back or for a leg, or they'll share mobility aids with each other, or tell each other where to find the cheapest prescription. Disabled people do this for each other all the time. We're interdependent. We have to be. We practice this. And this is something that I think that non-disabled people can really learn from the disability community, is how to rely on each other. It requires trust, requires agency, it requires honesty, requires direct communication, things that we often don't like. I'm in Minnesota, especially in Minnesota. We don't like talking about stuff directly.
Mhm.
But in order to practice interdependence, that's what's really needed. And I think this really ties for me to my Christian faith and to the Christian tradition, especially in the life and teachings of Jesus, who did not go it alone. Very specifically, very intentionally did his ministry in community with people, maybe took breaks when he needed to, like we all do. But his ministry and the nature of his work on this earth was inherently relational. And he taught that we all need each other and we all have to care for each other. We all have to support one another in big ways and small. And so this idea of interdependence, I think, permeates everything that I do, both theologically and in my theological work and my professional ministry, but also in how I live my own life as a disabled person and frankly as a human being on this earth.
Yeah. Can you speak a little bit more to maybe even just how you experience the disability community, or how you see people, what different ways are people connecting around some of these things that you listed? What does that look like?
Yeah, totally. So I'm so indebted to the disability community. Something I'll say frequently in my work is that I've learned how to be disabled from other disabled people. And by that, I mean that no one has a stake in my survival as much as other disabled people. My government doesn't, my health insurance company doesn't, my employer doesn't, or I mean, I have a great employer, but the people who really have a stake in my survival and thriving and flourishing are other disabled people who've been in this situation. And so like I said, the many things that disabled people do for each other. I remember when I was in seminary, I had a good friend who was disabled, and something that really helped her chronic pain was taking a bath, and she didn't have a bath in her apartment, and so she would come into our apartment every so often and she would take a bath, and it was just like, yes, of course, this is how we show up for each other in community. And so it's ways like that, and it's creating disabled spaces where we can experience the joy of disability and the uniqueness, and laugh at jokes that we make that are about our disability. I have a really good friend who's legally blind, and she tells this story about one year for Halloween she didn't have a costume, and so she wanted to pull down a window dressing and go as a blind. And she would tell this to people, and they didn't know if they could laugh or not. She was like, "This is so funny." And I tell people, and they don't know. And so I think of disability as community, as a space like we can laugh about these things,
Right.
we can tell each other jokes and be honest about who we are. Um, and then there's beautiful disability community spaces for art, especially beautiful places for disability dance. Again, Sins Invalid is a beautiful place for a home for disabled art, and I can post a link for that in the comments or in the description of this video. They're a longtime disability justice collective. But things like disabled dance and disabled poetry and disabled music and songwriting and disabled burlesque and just things that disabled people performing with our bodies and our minds the ways that we are, and celebrating and embracing that. That's something that I find really powerful in disability community. And I'll say I feel, even though I don't, my disability isn't physical, it's a mental health condition. It's not related to my body, in as much as we're all related to our bodies. But when I'm in spaces that are disability centric, I feel comfortable doing things with my body that I don't in other spaces. So for example, I was at a conference recently, and it was about a disability theology conference, and I was feeling really tired, and it had been a long day. And I looked around, and there were folks doing all sorts of things with their bodies, standing up, laying down, stimming, or fidgeting. So I thought, I don't have to sit in this chair. I can go stand in the back of the room and walk around. And I did, and it helped me focus a lot better. My own kind of ability to be in my body, that was opened up by the way that I saw other people being in their bodies. And that's something that the disability justice movement says about disability all the time, is that when the world is better for disabled people, it's better for everybody. And especially the formal disability justice movement, which was founded around 2005 by Black and brown, disabled, queer, and trans people of color. The disability justice movement says when the world is better for the most marginalized, when the most marginalized are leading the change in the world is better for everybody. And we can see this really specifically in things like, ramps, right? What's a classic kind of access improvement is ramps. People think about ramps and elevators, and these are great for disabled people. They're great, they're great for elders who are frequently disabled. They're great for young disabled people. They're also great for strollers, right? For people with strollers who don't, who can't go upstairs, who might not be disabled, might not, have thought about this as an access need, but again, when the world is better for disabled people, it's better for families, it's better for kids, it's better for babies. I think about I went to grad school in New York, and for any of you who've spent time in the New York City subway system, you'll have seen this, but the way that people get strollers in up and down the subway is they carry them.
Mhm.
And someone will carry the front and someone will carry the back, and you'll just carry the stroller, sometimes with the child inside it, all the way up the flight of stairs. And it's not uncommon for a stranger to get kind of conscripted or to offer to help. And so to be carrying the stroller up, these steep flights of stairs, which again is a beautiful manifestation of interdependence, but also, what if there were more elevators? What if all these people didn't have to carry their strollers up the stairs? And there have been terrible accidents of people falling down the stairs in the New York City subway system with strollers, and injuries and deaths that happen. And it's all because there's not enough access. And so we think about, what we do for disabled people is going to help everybody. We just know that, as Paul Wellstone would say, Minnesota hero, we all do better when we all do better.
I'll do better.
And yeah, and that's true for, making our spaces more accessible and more inclusive for disabled people too.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, started doing work with disabled people when I was in undergrad, but I think and in some ways in a home situation where the home, was adapted to become accessible because it was a respite care location that I was helping with. But it really wasn't until when I had two, young kids in the double stroller, where you start to realize like which particular buildings you can get in and you can't get in and out of. And then on top of it, the bathroom access with the double stroller and
Yeah.
and just mostly churches, right?
Yeah.
That are challenging. I mean, and so that's really in terms of the religious spaces where, it makes them less inviting. They're not only less inviting to children too,
Yeah.
and especially and also disabled people, right? So accessing the sacristy or the altar or
Right.
is really
Exactly.
challenging. And so for them to participate sometimes in liturgically as ministers is just even more doubly, triply challenging.
Yeah. Well, I love that you brought that up, because I think when people think about church renovations, like, oh, you have to be able to get to, the where the pews are or where the chairs are. And then so often there's still steps to the altar, exactly like you said. There's steps to the altar, there's steps to the sacristy, there's, one bathroom, on that level, and it's not accessible. And so then you have to go all the way down and around, and so thinking about, what does real accessibility look like? And a lot of times, people smarter than me have said this, but it's a failure of imagination. We just don't imagine that anyone who can't do stairs could go on the altar. We just can't imagine that people who can't do stairs would be in our sanctuary. We just can't imagine that people who can't do stairs would go in the sacristy. It's just we fail to imagine that every single human being shares the same sort of call to shared ministry and shared responsibility in the life of the church and the life of the community. But we don't imagine that. That's a shortfalling on us. And so I have many disabled friends who are preachers or ministers or lay leaders who will get to a church and be told that it's accessible, and then they get there and they, have to preach on the, floor. They can't preach on the, where the altar is. And so things like that just happen to disabled people all the time, that we just don't exactly think through all of the steps of accessibility until it's too late. And the other thing I'll say about this is, I think people, I mean, I've heard this all the time as someone who, works for access, especially in religious spaces. But people say, oh, when we need that, we'll build it. Oh, when someone comes who needs that, then we'll make it happen. No one here needs that. And it just is it just is such a silly thing to say. I mean, both because there's already people in your congregation who would benefit from it. 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 people are disabled, and disability spans a wide range. But if your congregation's bigger than 4 or 5 people, man, you've got disabled folks there, and you've got people who would benefit from access in all sorts of ways, even if they're not going to come up to you and ask for something.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's just not true that there's not someone in your congregation who could benefit from it. But B, I mean, the reality, and again, this is a failure of our imagination in the other direction, is disability can happen at any time. You could have a really long-time member of your congregation, your pastor. Again, I'm in Minnesota. You can slip on the ice. You're in a cast for the next 2 months. You're using mobility aids and all of a sudden you can't get to the altar. Well, man, that is too late to build a ramp. Like you needed that ramp 6 months ago, And so again, it just like we are so, as a society, so scared of disability. We hate talking about it. We hate thinking about it. It's scary. I don't want to be like them. This goes back to I want to be in control. I want to be self-sufficient. I want to do it on my own. And then also a side of I don't want to be treated like I treat those people, right? Like we're scared of disability for all these reasons. And that means we just don't like to think about how often disability happens. Accidents and illness and injury, disability can happen to any of us at any time, None of us are immune from becoming disabled. And so the idea that, oh, we'll just put it in when someone needs it, it's like you can't build a ramp overnight. You can't put in an elevator in 3 weeks. We have to be prepared. We have to assume that disabled people are coming to our congregation, and vice versa, that people coming to our congregation will become disabled. And the more we're ready for that, the more we can really live into these Christian values of inclusion and preparedness.
And I just really appreciate your comments, because really what you're trying to do also too is just, I mean, to a certain extent, normalize it, right? As an experience. So, in my case, I had thyroid cancer. Now I'm going on, what year are we in? 12 years ago. So I'm like reliant for my life on medicine for the rest of my life. I have to have these meds. They have to be dosed correctly. I have to take them in a certain way, like the whole about eating and all the hormonal stuff going on.
Totally.
So those things just happen. And you, like you're saying, they're not always sort of visible or out there.
No.
Right? Like, especially if you're talking about having a mental health disability sometimes. And then sometimes it's the energy of putting on the face.
Right.
Totally. Right. Of like, how do you discern, like, where do you show it? Where do you not show it? How do you be authentic in different situations? And just the mindfulness and the energy that takes can be really, it can be a gift, I think, but it can also it can be challenging.
All right, I'm back.
Okay. Maybe a little internet glitch.
It can totally be challenging. And, the other, just thinking about also this idea of kind of chronic disability and chronic illness and chronic pain, I think another thing that we're scared about for disability is that it can last for a long time, or maybe forever. And I recently have encountered, I had a really dear friend and mentor get into a horrific car crash, and people, gave to her GoFundMe and brought her meals, for like the first 3 weeks. But then it's like she still needs a lot of care. She's still got a long road to recovery. She still can't cook for herself, and she's still, they still need donations. And I think we as a society, it's so hard for us to grasp kind of the chronicness of what emotional or physical pain could be, or the toll of illness over a long period of time. We are much better at kind of a short-term crisis, and it's much harder in the long term. And you brought up cancer. I have a close friend who's disabled and also is going through cancer treatment. She has stage 4 metastatic breast cancer. And she's talked about this, and it's, a terminal illness and a terminal diagnosis. And she talks about having friends leave her and explicitly say, this is too hard for me. I can't be around you. And I can't watch you die. And as a society, we don't have that muscle, we just to sit with pain and hurt.
I'm feeling that, especially because my best friend is in the similar situation. And people, I don't get it, Allison. People have said to me, oh, wow, you're such a great friend. You've stuck. And I'm like, wait, in what world would I not be there for her and her husband? Like, I don't even fathom that. Like, no, part of me getting back to Minnesota was so I could be closer to them. Like, you just don't understand, that's not, so what is it that is that mindset? Like, it's too hard that people can't deal. And maybe this is what you were saying before about like, people can't deal with their own discomfort around this. So like, even for people who don't sort of understand themselves as having any disability or even any precarity, which I can't understand that either. How, getting people to understand this involves being human, involves the whole range of human emotions.
Yes. Yeah.
And being able to carry those and carry people through their life experiences. I mean, if you
Totally.
love someone, you love someone.
That's right. One thing I love this question of like, where do people get that? And my answer as a Christian theologian is it's not from our scriptures. You know, it sure as hell is not from the story of Jesus, who, stuck by his friends and they stuck by him to death, and through lots of pain and oppression and hardship and persecution and, physical pain and mental and emotional pain. This is a story of people who stuck by each other. It's a story of a God who sticks by us. That's what the whole gospels are about, is God comes to the world. We're in this season of Advent right now, preparing for God coming into the world and sticking with us through all of it, through all of Jesus's life and death. But then as a Christian, I believe through my own life as well. And so I think about like, where do people get this? I'm like, well, it's not from my Bible. It's not from my gospels, So it's these lies that we get from the world that just doesn't want us to do it.
Right. And also just culturally, being raised in the, white Christian dominant culture, like we weren't, in Minnesota, we weren't sort of trained in how to deal with our emotions or like acknowledge that, I'll speak for myself as someone in her mid 50s. Like that was something I had to sort of figure out once I started having children, of like, oh yeah, all these really intense emotions are there. Like,
Yeah.
to figure them out as I'm raising my kids, and then a whole nother layer of that after divorce. But
Yeah.
you're like, not, because it is culturally, it's not even pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It is like a certain, and maybe, I don't know, as a Catholic, I did have a solid sense of community and connection, I must say that. But especially when I'm doing spiritual directions, sometimes for people of other Protestant denominations, where they have a much more like isolationist kind of view.
Totally. Well, I want to go back to something you said earlier about normalizing disability, because I think this is so key. And one of my favorite disability theologians, her name is Deborah Creamer, in her work on disability theology, she talks a lot about this idea of that disability is fundamentally about limits. She calls it the limits model of disability. In this understanding, what I really love about this is she says, all humans are limited. And I think, by extrapolation, all beings are limited. Everything created on this earth has limits. But she talks about humans and how all humans have limits. And I think about my own limits. I'm ambulatory. I walk. I don't use mobility aids. I can't run a marathon. That is a total limit for me. Barring some serious change in my life, I will never run a marathon. That's a totally limit for me. But that limit is judged very differently than someone who has a limit of not being able to walk or not being able to walk all the time. So I really like kind of the nuance here is that we all have limits. I wear glasses, my eyesight is limited, but I'm not judged in the same way as someone whose eyesight is more limited, such that they can't read print or they read in Braille or they have to, use a navigation aid or a guide dog to go where they're going. And so I think I really like this idea of limits. But what I most like about Deborah Creamer's work is she says disability is a fundamentally unsurprising part of being human. She says, with all the diversity in humanity, it would be so much more surprising if disability didn't exist. And I just really love that she says, this is just part of the gig, like part of the wide range of human diversity and gender and, all sorts of physical descriptions and race and ethnicity and language and, geographic origin. There's so much diversity in being human. It would be so much more surprising if all of our bodies worked exactly the same way. It is such a natural and expected part of human diversity that disability exists and that disabled people exist. And I think when we start from that premise, viewing disability as both a form of diversity, one among many of human diversity, and also having its own culture, which is something we talked about earlier, what it is to be in a disability cultural space. I think that the view we shift from disability as like a deficit or an anomaly or something to be scared of. Like, oh yeah, of course there's disability. And of course people can't see. Of course people walk differently. Of course people have different speech patterns. Like, it would be so much more surprising if we didn't.
Yeah, and I think as you were talking about this limits model, I love how much this really is reflective of a more integral sense of of embodiment as well, because that's one of the areas that I feel like Christian and Catholic theology especially has been so weak, right? It's just been ironic of how we have this theology of the incarnation, but yet we aren't dealing with our own human bodies
Yeah.
and how, I heard it was this one medical doctor who was getting into the mind body connection early on. And she was talking about how life is the intersection of the physical and the spiritual, like where the physical and the spiritual meet is life. And I just love that. It's
Yeah.
because it's where they go together. And
Yes.
and in some cases we're denying the physical part and that is limited. Like we are
Yeah.
made up of specific atoms and
Yes.
and but then also the spiritual side of it. We're also neglecting that too.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
so I just love how this really emphasizes that intersection point and the particularity of each person and their experience too.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I love how you're talking about kind of Catholics and bodies. This is something as a Catholic and a lifelong Catholic, I'm always like, Catholics should be getting bodies like so right.
Yes.
Like this body, the body of Christ, incarnate and transubstantiated. This is the source and the summit of our faith. That's what we say and what we believe. Communion, Eucharist, God in real time in our liturgical home. This is what it's about to be Catholic. Witnessing this miracle, this magical transformation, and then bringing God's body into our body. I mean, that is it for Catholics. And at the same time, we have such terrible theology about bodies in
Yeah.
so many ways. I mean, I think about this as a queer person, what I'm told about my body as a queer person, as a disabled person, what I'm told about my body as a disabled person. There are, I mean, I can't even count the number of stories that even I just know about Catholic churches which have denied disabled people sacraments. I mean, it happens all the time. I just read an article. This is not planted. I just read an article today about this happening again at a Catholic school in Covington, Kentucky,
Wow.
about a disabled Black student who was denied Eucharist by a teacher. This has happened. There's two separate stories that happened within just a couple months of each other in 2019 in the Catholic Diocese of Newark, New Jersey.
Mm-hmm.
Two separate autistic children. One was denied. One was denied First Communion after going through communion prep because the pastor said, "Oh, he can't understand. He doesn't understand what communion is, so he can't take it." And so he was denied again. Like for Catholics, this is the source and the summit of our faith. He was denied this intimate access to the divine because
Mm-hmm.
this one priest said he, just decided he can't understand it. And then there's another story of a child preparing for a sacrament, and the priest kicked him out of the church because he was making too much. I guess his sibling was preparing for a sacrament, and this kid got kicked out of the church because he was autistic and he was making too much noise and
Yeah.
distracting the priest.
Yeah. Yeah.
And just the number of stories that I don't even know, but it just happens all the time. And thinking as a
Yeah.
Catholic sacramental people, I mean, who are we to interfere with the connection between God and other human beings? We should be facilitating that, promoting that, right? We want more and more of this connection, and something about how we view disability means that we get it wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we use it as like a weapon too, sometimes. The sacraments get weaponized. And I think, maybe you brought up in one of your writings, or maybe we talked about it, that, just this whole idea of people like getting prayed over. I had an experience of when I was young and an older sister had scoliosis and was at like a prayer meeting, prayed. I mean, and the whole thing was like guilt that she didn't have enough quote unquote faith to like,
Yes.
and I just remember as a child, I think it was probably like 7 or 8 years. I was like, that is just ridiculous. Like I already knew and just kind of blew it off. And like as siblings, we're like, whatever, that was weird. And then my
Right.
parents kind of stopped going, right? Which was good. So then
Yeah.
you get like the critical side of this. And then that whole other prayer group like broke off from the church eventually, which is really weird too. I mean,
Wow.
it's the ways that I think it also has to deal with, we both love scripture, but sometimes I think the ways that the healing miracles are utilized, in the gospels and the way they're interpreted in churches is
Totally.
helpful.
Totally. This is something that disability theologians talk about a lot. And if you really want to kind of dig into the healing miracles and the kind of pros and cons and what can we really take away from this, I really recommend Bethany McKinney Fox's book, Healing in the Way of Jesus.
Mm,
Um, and she really talks about, she incorporates a lot of disability perspectives, speaks from her own perspective, grounded in scriptural research and in her experience in the disability community, and really digs into them. So if you want to go into more depth about the healing miracles, I really
yeah.
recommend the work of Bethany McKinney Fox. But I'll also say, like, yeah, totally. I mean, I wrote my master's thesis on this concept I coined of Christian ableism. This
Mhm.
idea that Christians aren't more ableist than anybody else. They're not uniquely ableist, but Christianity is distinctly ableist, and that there are forms of ableism which could not exist without Christianity. And when I say ableism, what I'm talking about is systemic discrimination against disabled people. This is the ways that our world is not set up for disabled people and hurts them. And then Christian ableism, it's the ways that Christianity and our Christian institutions play into that sort of ableism. And a big marker of Christian ableism is these prayers to Jesus for a miracle cure. I mean, it just happens all the time. It's happened to me. It's happened to every disabled person I know who interacts with Christianity specifically, has been prayed over for a miracle cure. I mean, it just happens all the time, and often it involves non-consensual touch. Being prayed on, like on a bus, on a city bus. Someone lays their hands on you as you're walking down the street. I mean, disability activist Imani Barbaran talks about being prayed over 14 times in the same day. Again, non-consensually in public, didn't ask for it, living her life 14 times in the same day. And she she tells the story is she talks about she's at a conference and she told that story about being prayed over so many times in one day and getting into why that's bad and how it it's really painful and harmful, and it's kind of it's often embarrassing. Again, this piece about non-consensual touch. And then kind of going back to this core of people saying, you must not have enough faith. If you had enough faith, you'd be healed. So she's getting into all of that and talking about how uncomfortable it is. And she said after she finished that talk, people came up to her and laid hands on her and prayed over her. It just is the most astonishing story about people just kind of, getting hit on the head with it and just still not getting it. What is this instinct that we cannot get away from? And I think it often is what we've heard in our preaching and what the interpretations of these scriptures are, that if you pray for someone enough, they will be magically cured. And I'll get into this a little bit because the way I describe kind of prayers for a miracle cure is in
Yeah.
this divine triangle, and I guess divine awkwardness triangle, I'll say. And at one corner of the triangle is God, and at another corner of the triangle is whoever's praying for you, and at this corner of the triangle is the person who's being prayed for. And what you have is, because most of the time, I would say, after these prayers for a miracle cure, there is no immediate magical miracle cure, right? I mean, it doesn't happen. I'm not saying never. People have their own beliefs about miracles and medicine, but in my life and the lives of those close to me, this magical change does not happen. And so I talk about this triangle, this awkward divine triangle, because it puts everyone in a bad spot, because it says, well, is it God is not strong enough? God's not powerful enough to cure me? Or is it the faith of the person praying isn't strong enough? Or is it the disabled person is so messed up that not even God can heal them? It just, like, nobody wins. It puts you in this triangle where, like, everybody loses and everybody's not enough. And so how instead can we say, again, disability is an expected part of human diversity, and why would we wish it away? If someone is comfortable in their disability, it's part of their
Yeah.
identity, it's how
Yeah.
they see themselves. why would you try to change it? It's like trying to change someone's, I mean, it's very similar to things like conversion therapy, right? Forcing
Right.
someone
Right.
to change their sexuality, right? It's all these ways that we cause people
Yes.
harm by
Yes.
forcing them to change things that are just part of who they are.
Yeah.
So I can't speak enough about, like, if you've ever had an inclination to pray over a disabled person, just say no.
And it's also, I mean, the whole thing is not far from intrinsically disordered, right? It's sort
Oh,
of an
totally.
implicit version of it. It's not as explicit theologically, but I I would say, um, and it's been interesting in my work in spiritual direction, or say coaching people who have disabilities. It is much more work around trusting God in whatever is.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of times, even because my background's all in, formation for professional ministry. And a lot of times when people are talking about faith, I keep saying, nope, just in some ways, cut that word out of your vocabulary and focus on trust. Like focus
Yeah.
on trusting God and trusting that in yourself.
Yes.
And that inner voice will direct you,
Yes.
you know, where you're supposed to go, or how, around, if you are supposed to take action in a certain direction
Right.
or not. That's where that ultimate trust connection, you were talking about agency, honesty. You have to have
Yeah.
it with yourself,
Yeah.
right? And then be able to bring that into trusting others through this
Yes.
interdependence in the
Yeah.
community.
That's
Um,
totally right. That's totally right. And yeah, and to think about how we can, how could you trust someone who, whenever you talk to them, just wants you to change, like, that doesn't build trust.
mhm.
If you just in your church life or your community life or relationship, people are always talking to you about trying to change your disability or get rid of it. That's not a way to build trust. And now I do want to say that, there are some disabled people who, if they could, would get rid of their, disability, or at least a symptom of it. Like, I can't live with this pain anymore, this physical pain or this emotional pain, or the nausea, or the, whatever, these things. There's things about disability that can be really uncomfortable, or just not what people want. And that we deserve, people who are disabled deserve to have access to the healthcare treatment they want and need. And this means, dramatic overhauls to the ways that our system works now. 1 in 4 diabetic people ration insulin. People die by rationing insulin, and it's because they can't afford their insulin, which costs, nothing to make and is sold at incredibly high prices by people who, again, they don't care about diabetics, they care about money. And so when we think about, like, it's kind of these two hands of, like, both, disabled people deserve to be able to choose to live as they are and to love themselves and to find their identity in the ways that their body and minds work. And disabled people deserve to have access to healthcare and medical choices and to have the agency they need to, whatever treatments that they, would help them, whatever sorts of medications, whatever lifestyle, access changes would help them. So it's kind of both of this, that disabled people deserve to live as they are and as they accept themselves, then also deserve, like we all do, to have
Mhm.
access to those things that would make their life better. But the word for me is the agency. It's who's choosing, the treatment, or who's choosing the medical
Right.
care, who's choosing the, lifestyle change or adaptation. And for me, I always say it should be the person who's affected by it,
Right.
who's making the decision and who has the agency. And that's really my test of, does this feel good or does this feel icky? And I go back to, who's making the decision here.
Mhm. Along those lines, in terms of maybe your experience or in your ministry with disabled people, like, what are you finding? Are they choosing anything specific around, like, spiritual practice, those types of things? Where do you see that happening for disabled people?
It's a really good question. I see in this regard a lot of overlap between the disability community and the queer community, which is,
Mm,
a lot of them have been very hurt by Christianity. Again,
mhm.
for reasons that we've talked about, this idea of Christian ableism, the denial of the sacraments, the prayers for a miracle cure. This other part of Christian ableism I talk about is this especially happens with people who are developmentally disabled or neurodivergent, non-speaking especially. who are told that they're angels, right? They're sinless, they're angels, they couldn't possibly do something wrong. I have a good friend who has an older sister with Down syndrome, and in the middle of Mass one day, the pastor walked over and told her to stand up in the middle of Mass, in the middle of his homily, and told the whole congregation, she's an angel, she's an example of how to live an angelic life. So it's these sorts of things, again, that happen all the time that make up what I'm calling Christian ableism. And that's been really harmful to a lot of disabled people in the same way that similar things have been really harmful to queer people. And so you'll find a lot of disabled people who've grown up Christian or grown up Christian adjacent, but are not really willing to reconnect in a institutional Christian church. They might engage in kind of some more meditative spiritual practices, and a lot more kind of less institutional, so more kind of groups of peers or independent spiritual practice, but it not to a person. Of course, I'm on the United Church of Christ Disabilities Ministries board. I'm now the co-chair. That's a whole board of disabled people who are United Church of Christ and very involved in the church. But whenever I'm talking to disabled people and disabled community, which is not explicitly religious, I always, there's a lot of caveats about inviting someone to a Christian event or a congregation or something like that. Just, I feel like I tread very lightly and take very seriously the harm that's been done. I do co-facilitate a spiritual reflection space for disabled people. I co-founded it and co-facilitate it. And it's called the Disability Theology Discussion Group. We meet twice a month. Once a month is for like a discussion of some sort of content, a book chapter, a YouTube video, or a song. And the other time we meet a month is for like personal emotional check-in, kind of sharing more deeply what's going on in our lives. And this is a space by and for disabled people, and that's disabled and mad and mentally ill and chronically ill and folks who have chronic pain and neurodivergent folks. It's a big, big tent kind of disabled, which is the way that I do all of this work. It's very big tent. And it's a space where we can be ourselves and talk about stuff like this and our experiences. And that's been a very healing space. I mean, even for me, and I'm someone who is really churchy. I work in churches. I go to church.
Yeah.
But it's still, there's something about being in a space with other people who have shared experience, even across disability. But, my experiences as a, disabled person are, I can have so much in common with someone who is a wheelchair user, who's had similar experiences as my friend who's blind, as, my friend who's autistic. We can have such similar experiences. We can be treated so similarly by Christians or by churches or in other institutions, even though our disabilities are so different. And so these beautiful cross disability spaces where we can share from our own experience and support and be supported by each other. Those have been some of the most meaningful spiritual spaces for me. And I know that those are important spaces for other disabled folks too, to be in solidarity and shared experience and reduce the feeling of isolation, honestly, and loneliness.
Yeah. Yeah, especially after COVID. I mean, it's just an experience that brings to me just sort of another layer of their shared common humanity and
Yes.
a place where you can bring compassion to yourself and to others in a way that you're not depersonalized, right? Like,
right.
Yeah, you are personalized and made
Yes.
particular
Yes. Yeah.
in those safe spaces. And that's for me the gift of ministry in so many ways.
Yeah.
It's core to our mission at Wisdom Ways is how do we create these safe spaces where people can be themselves and really
Yes.
explore whatever it means for them, God or the divine or sacred, to be present in their lives and in their personhood, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. And how people experience that, the spirit or whatever the power of the spirit may be
Yes.
to them and that.
And again, going back to this idea of connection, you talked about the pandemic being so isolating. A lot of my work is with kids and youth. And the effects of the pandemic on kids and youth are just astonishing. I mean, they affected all of us in different ways that really pertain to where we were in life and in our 8 stages of development and in our careers and in our geographic and residential situations. But for these kids, a lot of them are really kind of stuck developmentally where they were when the pandemic happened. And so this year I'm working with this group of ninth graders, and they are really struggling they were, basically in sixth grade when this happened, sixth, seventh grade. And just the way that, and now they're expected to be in ninth grade, and just thinking about the ways that this has impacted all of us. And one major way it's impacted us is by isolating us, taking us away from each other, bringing us, thinking that, again, this idea that we have to do it alone and that we're all alone and there's no one looking out for us. And that's just such a sad and hard way to live. And so again, I come back to this idea of like, this interdependence is so important, especially as we continue to heal, kind of psychosocially and spiritually from the pandemic, from this time that was so isolating for a lot of us, and that continues to be really isolating for a lot of disabled folks who still are not safe enough to go out in the community because we haven't made it safe enough for them. And so I think I appreciate you bringing in the pandemic, because I think that's kind of this, again, like how do we combat isolation? How do we reconnect to community? How do we lean into our shared spirituality and shared experiences and build relationship and deepen connection, instead of, giving into the temptation that we can do it alone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, maybe just a couple more things before we head away. I did want to say, because I know you mentioned a couple resources for us to read or to think about. Is there any other, maybe 2 or 3 more resources or readings where you would tell people who are kind of new to this area and want to learn more about it to start?
Absolutely. So here's 2 that I think are great. And one is a disability justice resource, again, from the disability justice movement. And one is disability theology, coming from the Christian tradition. The disability theology piece is called The Disabled God, and it's a book by Nancy Eastland, who's a theologian and actually an anthropologist, who passed away at an early age, but she was disabled herself. And in The Disabled God, it gives, among other things, an incredibly robust history of the disability rights movement in the United States, from her perspective. But then the last, maybe third or half of the book, is this beautiful theological treatise on Eucharist and communion and disability, which is beautiful. But probably the most cited part of her book is when she talks about the disabled God, by which she means Jesus, when he's resurrected, having wounds and being wounded. And in fact, his wounds being a way that the disciples knew him and knew who he was. And she talks about how that means that Jesus is disabled. The resurrected body of God is disabled and has disability and probably pain. And I mean, definitely trauma. You think about all these things that Jesus went through and then comes back. And I think often we have this idea. I just saw this picture today of like a very buff Jesus, like a very like bodybuilder kind of Jesus. And I think we think that a lot. But when you actually look at the text, what it says is that the resurrected body of God could have been anything. God could have had whatever body God wanted, post-resurrection. And the body God chooses is a disabled body. And she really talks about what that means in terms of how we treat disabled people and the unique and particular connection and access point that disabled people have to the divine through a God who understands their embodied experiences. I really recommend that as a starting place if you're looking for Christian theological resources in particular. And then in terms of for the disability justice movement, again, this movement created by Black and Brown disabled queer and trans folks, that really focuses on the leadership of the most marginalized and really talks about how kind of the disability rights movement was very, very white led. It was led by a lot of white people and led by a lot of people who would benefit from kind of legal change. The disability justice movement talks about there's a lot of disabled people who are not going to benefit from that. There are a lot of disabled people who need things that, the law is either never going to recognize or is never going to work for us, because, they're Black or brown or queer or trans or have, immigrants or don't speak English or have whatever other sorts of background. And so I really appreciate their work and have learned a lot from the work of the disability justice movement, and always want to uplift them as a major teacher and instructor for me and a community to whom I hope my work is accountable. And if you're interested in digging into that more, I would look at the Disability Justice Primer created by Sins Invalid. When the Disability Justice Primer is really kind of it's like 10 points, and it just very short, very easy to read, accessible to folks of all kinds, with all sorts of academic backgrounds and neurotypes, and just states very clearly what it is that the disability justice movement is about. And it's there that you'll find things like interdependence, like centering the leadership of the most marginalized. Some of these things that I've touched on, the ways that increased access and care for disabled folks helps all of us. Things like nobody is disposable, and we all matter, and we care for all of us, and all of our lives are important. While centering the particularities of certain lives that are not treated that way. So those are two resources I'd really recommend: the Disability Justice Primer and then Nancy Eastland's Disabled God. Those will get you far. They'll point you in the right direction to do some more really good work. And if you're more into movies, I also really recommend the documentary Crip Camp, which is on Netflix, and it talks about the work of Judy Heumann, who's a longtime disability rights activist. I really recommend that as well.
Okay, you said Crypt Camp?
It's called Crip Camp.
Crip Camp. Okay.
Yeah, and that's, if you're more into movies than reading, I really recommend that as well, for kind of, again, going back to this: what is disability community? What is disability culture? That really breaks some of that down.
Yeah. Wow. Well, any last thoughts here as we're closing? Any other last things you'd like to get in that we didn't talk about, or in closing?
Well, just, I'm so grateful to be here, and I just to shout out my connection to the CSJs, which has been so important to me. I came in contact with the CSJs in 2015 when I did the St. Joseph Worker program here in St. Paul. That's what got me to Minnesota. And it was really through the program and through the connections I made, and the friendships and community that I had after that, that pointed me on the path to seminary very directly. I remember I gave, actually probably around this time, an Advent reflection at one of the Advent evening prayers in the chapel. And it was after that that I had folks say, have you thought about going to seminary? Have you thought about preaching? Have you thought about ministry? And so over the course of that year and the next year, really discerned a call to ministry. And that's what led me on the path to doing disability theology, which is what I'm doing now and what I love. And really kind of a lot of that grew out of my own spiritual understanding and influence of the sisters specifically, and then also the kind of ministry I got to do while I was in the St. Joseph Worker program that led me to where I am now. So it's very cool to be kind of giving back to this community that set me on the path to be where I am now. And
well, we'll definitely keep you looped in. And I appreciate too, as someone who was probably amongst the first generation of women, and this is in the 90s, trained by actually sisters who were Bible scholars, right?
yes.
So they were trained and maybe had a little bit of academic reading written by women, coming out of the 60s, 70s, but they were actually, training me. And so, but I still feel like as women in Christianity and Catholicism, we're just still way behind where we should be. And we're not being invited. Like I'm invited much more into Protestant spaces than right? So, which is kind of ironic and interesting, because there's a solid sort of Catholic leadership women, but there's challenges still. And a great need to keep raising up voices like yours and our experiences, and just really highlighting what women from all of our diverse experiences are able to bring to the church community in a really rich way. So
I agree. Yeah.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. I'm so grateful that you were here, and look forward to maybe future conversations or collaborations along the way with Wisdom Ways.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, and thanks folks for tuning in. It's a blessing.